My name's Sam Jones, as Gary said. I work with Scott Orford at the Wales Institute of Social Economic Research and Data based at Cardiff University. And this afternoon I'd like to share some of the work that Scott and I have been doing on interrelationships of place in Wales. It's very much a work in progress, and we'd appreciate your feedback at what is a relatively early stage. And the work we'd like to do involves examining the extent to which places in Wales are dependent on each other for different kinds of assets. So that's kind of where we're going. Just to give you a bit of background, when I use the term assets, I'm referring to the main entities which people rely on to undertake sort of routine, mundane tasks in their local area. So going to doctors' surgeries or schools, jobs, shops, green space, that would all be considered assets of a place. And the research was really brought about by the rules that the Welsh Government imposed during the current pandemic situation, which forced people to stay local. As a result, anecdotal evidence suggested that many people lost access to a number of assets that they regularly relied on. And the loss of access became particularly apparent during Wales's local lockdowns, when services and businesses like hairdressers, gyms, shops, etc. were all still open at that point. But people were prohibited from leaving their local authority of residence, so they couldn't access the assets that they might normally access, for instance. So there were stories from my local area where by people who suddenly found that they had to travel a lot further to access services within their own local authority than perhaps they would have had to before, where they could just jump across the local authority boundary and access the nearest ones. So it became apparent during the pandemic that people regularly rely on a number of these assets, as we're describing them at the moment, that are outside of their local area to undertake tasks that are fairly routine or mundane, but nonetheless necessary and important for their own well-being. And this caused us to consider how these assets are shared between places under normal circumstances, outside of restrictions caused by a global pandemic. So, for instance, are places in Wales generally self-sufficient? Do they have enough assets to cater for their needs of their local population? Or are neighbouring places dependent on each other for certain types of assets? And if they are dependent on each other, what sort of assets are they dependent on for? And how does this vary across Wales? So are places more likely to be dependent on one another in certain parts of Wales compared to another? And all this is important because obviously if places share assets, that has implications for funding and resource allocation. And the implications that this has may vary across Wales depending on how the dependency of places varies across Wales. So that's really just a bit of background. So based on that, we came up with the following aim and objectives. So initially, the main aim of this research is trying to develop a set of metrics that can be used to classify towns and cities based on how dependent they are on places around them, based on a common set of public, commercial and social assets. In trying to achieve this, we had the following objectives: to identify metrics that can be used to better understand the availability of public, commercial, social assets. It's the first objective. The second thing, to develop a classification of places in Wales using these metrics to classify places based on their relationship with other places. So this became our interrelationships classification, which describes how dependent a place is on other places. And then to investigate the spatial interrelationships between places in Wales using this classification. And as I said, that bit's a work in progress, but we'll give you a little bit of explanation of what we've done so far. So this work really came about as part of a wider project called Understanding Welsh Places, where we worked with the Centre of Local Economic Strategies, who have done a lot of work on place dependency over the last 10 years or so. And the Understanding Welsh Places project involved the development of a web application, which is aimed at third sector organisations like local community groups and town councils. And these groups are often experts in place, but they're not experts in using or finding data. So this application is really intended to make data and stats about places in Wales easier for them to access and to remove those barriers a little bit. So it's a web application, as I said, and it's available at understandingwelshplaces.wales, the URL you can see on the screen for anyone who's interested in looking at it. But I'll just give you a very quick flavour of what the web application holds. So each place in Understanding Welsh Places has its own dashboard, and as well as providing access to the community assets data, which we'll come on to later, It also allows users to map the population flows to graph socioeconomic and demographic data, and also to compare between places. So this is the dashboard for Aberystwyth, but if I wanted to pull in data about Cardiff, I could add Cardiff as a place and compare the two. Before I go into the community assets data side of it, I think just need to cover a little bit about how we're defining places as part of the Understanding Welsh Places project. So they're defined using contiguous built-up areas, which are a combination of Office for National Statistics 2011 built-up areas dataset and the built-up areas with subdivisions dataset. So for those who aren't familiar with these, built-up area boundaries are delineated by merging together 50-meter squared grid cells, which are identified as having predominantly urban land use based on Ordnance Survey's topography layers. So that's how we these boundaries have been created. And using government boundaries made it relatively straightforward to use a wide range of existing government data, such as census data, which we can assemble from smaller area geographies using lookups. And a lot of that existed already, which was one main reason for using these boundaries to define our places. Welsh Government and other partners on the project requested that we only use contiguous built-up areas with residential populations of greater than or equal to 2,000 people to enable robust statistical analysis. So as a result, we end up with 193 of these places in Wales. Just to go on to the interrelationships side of it and the assets side of it. In terms of defining our interrelationships classification of place, we needed first to create a set of metrics to measure the numbers of assets in a place. This is the first objective on the earlier slide. And our choice of assets was based on the advice of Claire's, one of our partners, who had undertaken a similar exercise in Scotland as part of the Understanding Scottish Places web application. Also depended on the availability of nationally consistent data for Wales. So we had to be quite pragmatic about what we were going to include. And also on feedback from our user group. So in 2020, December 2020, we updated the metrics that go into this classification based on the feedback of users from the site. So based on the advice of Claire's, the indicators that we chose were selected with the intention of portraying three things. So the number of assets in a place compared to the local population, the diversity of a place's assets, particularly in terms of business or employment based across the three sectors that you can see on the slide, so across the social, commercial and public sector. And also the distance residents have to travel to access these assets, because obviously a place is going to be more independent or self-sufficient if these assets are closer together and residents don't have to travel so far. So the assets that we currently include are included in the table you can see on the slide, and they're split, as I said, across social, commercial and public sector assets. In terms of our methods that we use to create the interrelationship classification, we used the assets from this previous slide to put into this classification. And again, this was all done based on Claire's previous work in Scotland, which explored how reliant places are on neighbouring places. So the method, just very briefly, involved calculating the number of assets per head of population where appropriate, so for instance school places per head, and then involved ranking each of these asset metrics into sevenths, and each seventh was given a score. Then once all the places had been ranked and scored, these scores were aggregated into a total score for each place, and these total scores were used to categorize a place based on its dependence on other places. So places with higher scores have higher numbers of assets per population, for instance, so they're classified as independent, whereas places with lower scores have lower numbers of assets or similar metrics compared to their residential population, so they're classified as dependent. So this map shows the final distribution of the classification of our 193 places, and just from the visual you'll notice that places located far from other places, such as those in Mid Wales, tend to be more independent, whereas places that are clustered together, for instance in South East Wales, tend to be more interdependent or dependent. So that's really where we've got to in terms of developing our classification. I said we've done a little bit of analysis on this, so I'll just go into this quite briefly for the rest of the presentation. So as I mentioned, looking at interdependence of place by location. Firstly, you can see that the split of from the split of the types of places across Wales, that only about a fifth of places in Wales are classified as independent, making them self-sufficient. So that's the final columns in the table on the slide. About a quarter of places are dependent, suggesting that they are reliant on other places for a lot of their assets. And about half are interdependent, so they're somewhere in the middle. So they're reliant on other places for some of the assets, but perhaps are sufficiently reliant on their own assets for some of the metrics that we used. So if we break this down further by local authority type, we can immediately see that the classification of places in local authorities in the Welsh Valleys is quite different to the classifications in other types of authorities, in more urban authorities or more rural authorities. And the Welsh Valleys are the old industrial mining areas of South Wales, and they're often locations of deep persistent deprivation. So they're quite different areas anyway. Research has shown that they are quite different in many other socioeconomic characteristics. But we can see that places in the Welsh Valleys have a far higher proportion, nearly 2/5 of dependent places, and a far lower proportion of independent places compared to other areas in Wales. So it suggests that places in valleys are more dependent on their neighbouring places. Just to unpick this a little bit further, we wondered if this was just a reflection of settlement size. So thinking perhaps that places in the valleys are just generally smaller than in other parts of Wales, which would perhaps suggest that they would be more dependent because they're not big enough to support their own numbers of the different types of assets that we've talked about. But when we looked at these places by the populations, resident populations of the settlements, we can see that valleys actually contain relatively low proportions of small places compared to urban or rural parts of Wales. So places in the valleys are not that small. They're actually more mid-sized or large size compared to other places in Wales. So perhaps there's more to it than just settlement size. So if we break down our settlement sizes by our interrelationship classification, we can see that valleys places tend to be less independent and more interdependent or dependent on other places in Wales across all town sizes. So it's not just something that is relevant to one town size, it's something that's persistent. This idea that valleys towns are more dependent and interdependent is persistent across all sizes of towns in Wales. So it seems to suggest that the composition of towns in the valleys, along with their relationships with other towns, is actually quite different to what we see in other parts of Wales, the rural areas, or the what we've classified as the urban areas, so Swansea and Cardiff and Newport. Looking at this from a more statistical perspective, we ran some spatial autocorrelations to try and find clusters of similar entities based on their total interrelationship scores with the distance decay function. So we were specifically looking at clusters of high scores near high scores, so that's independent towns near other independent towns or clustered with other independent towns, or low scores near low scores, so dependent towns near other dependent towns, and then mixtures, so independent towns near dependent towns, where dependent towns may be relying on their nearby independent towns for assets. So just looking at this for the whole of Wales, we see that over half of the places in Wales, about 57%, do not display any significant spatial clustering at the 5% level, with the majority and the majority of spatial clustering that is present actually occurs within the Welsh Valleys areas, which you can see on the map. So just focusing on the valleys itself, which you can see at the bottom part of the visual, nearly all places are categorized as being dependent places which are close to other dependent places. So we've got these low clusters in the valleys. There's 36 of those in all. Or alternatively, independent places which are clustered with dependent places. So that's the high-low clusters, the pink dots on the map. And there's 17 of those in all. So this kind of follows what we might expect. So it suggests that dependent places are spatially clustered together, which maybe means that they're reliant on each other for these assets, these goods and services that we've mentioned. But it also suggests that independent places may display a lower degree of clustering with other independent places, which again we might expect because they're not so reliant on one another, but they display higher spatial clustering with dependent places. So these dependent places may be reliant on independent places for the provision of goods and services. Just unpicking these patterns with a slightly different approach. The Understanding World's Places project also gave us access to some mobile phone flow data, which we obtained from CityLogic via the Welsh Government. And these data model the flow of people based on a sample of mobile devices, which is interpolated to represent the full population based on the residential population at a lower super area level. And what we've done here is fairly basic at the moment. So we've calculated, so we've aggregated these flows up to our different places in Wales by our classification, our category in the classification, and then we've calculated what we would expect the flow to be against the model data which has been provided from the mobile phone signals from CityLogic. So our expected flows are really just, as I said, it's quite basic, they're really just based on the proportion of towns in each authority. So if there's 30%, I can't remember what we said now, 20% of towns in the valleys are dependent, then we've assumed that we would expect the flows to be about 20% as well, that can be attributed to those towns. And then we've obviously aggregated up the model data to see how that compares to what would be the expected data. So this just suggests that, well, firstly, it suggests that towns which are independent are more important in terms of their involvement in the flows than perhaps we would have expected based on their proportions. So the modeled flows is always higher than the expected flows for independent towns. So they're involved in more of the flows between places than perhaps we might have expected. Whereas dependent towns are involved in less of the flows than we might have expected. So it's fairly basic and simple at the moment. And these trends also hold true in the valleys. So it suggests what we've seen before in the previous slide about the clustering between dependent and independent places, that people are using independent places more than they're flowing to independent places, moving to and from independent places more than they are from dependent places. We haven't yet applied that. So that's just what we've done in the last week or so. So we haven't really applied that to the clustering that we showed on the previous slide, but that would obviously be the next step, because that would be interesting to see how the clustered flows match this fairly basic breakdown. We're also going to be looking at it with regard to individual places in the future. So this is just a map showing the flows between an independent place from the surrounding places, as happens to be Pontypridd, which is a main town in the South Wales Valleys. But we haven't done much on that yet. That's something that we need to look at going forward. So just to sum up, provide some conclusions. So this initial investigation into interrelationships between places in Wales has identified, we think, that Welsh valleys are slightly different than other parts than other places in Wales. So they're more reliant on neighbouring places for supplying goods and services and assets, like we've said before. And perhaps one takeaway point from this is that it has important implications on the use of local services and resources in these places, because perhaps independent places are providing for the needs of more people than just their local population. So that has perhaps some implications for the supply and demand and funding of local services. And it also has important implications for perhaps for transport policy and things like that, as we see people flowing, as we can sort of better understand why and where people are flowing to, and might have implications for things like the South Wales Metro. So future work, just to finish up because we're over time, I think. Obviously, we're going to be trying to do some more investigation using this interrelationship classification to look at the spatial aspects of these classifications in Wales. And we'd like to do a bit more analysis using the CityLogic mobile phone data, which we've only really touched on in the last week or two. And we'd also like to just do some sense checking of our interrelationship classification. So try and fine tune it to understand whether different assets are more important in different parts of Wales compared to others. Perhaps that varies, for instance, by local demographic characteristics. So that's something that we need to consider, and perhaps we need to weight the classification in different ways depending on the different type of area. And then we also need to consider the impact of cross-border flows, because obviously it's quite permeable, the border between Wales and England, with people using different assets on different sides of the border. So that's something that we need to understand a little bit more, and that's something that we'll be doing with the Understanding Welsh Places project in general in the future anyway. So that's the where we've got to with this. Thanks for your listening, and thanks for your time. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
The CLSE database was developed in pre-COVID times in Scotland. I'm just wondering how transferable it is to Wales in COVID times, really. I mean, are the variables appropriate still? I mean, did you consider other variables? You've got a classification of social economy, commercial databases, commercial and public services. Were there any other variables that could have been useful as part of this classification that you considered?
Yeah, probably, but I think we just relied really on Claire's advice on that, and this work was done back in well, the initial classification was developed in about 2018, I think, so a little bit before COVID times. But I guess it's something that we would have to revisit, given the changes over the last 12 months or so, to look at other variables that might now be important to people. I suppose distance to work and things like that might not be so important as it was back when the Claire's developed their classification. So that's something that perhaps we'd have to revisit.
And all these variables are equally weighted, are they? I mean, they're assumed to be equally important.
Yeah, at the moment, yeah, that's where we've taken it. But that's obviously something that we need to look at, because it might vary by place. I suppose if a place has a younger demographic or an older demographic, different types of assets will be more important or less important. So that's something that needs to be considered in the future.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. What are the reasons why LSOAs or super urban areas are not used for places? Was size only based on population and not size of spatial area?
Yes, that's a good question. So I think we were just the size of the places is just based on the residential population. I can't really comment on why we didn't use low suburb areas. Scott's going to come in on that and just.
Yeah, so we worked with the Welsh Government on this and the ONS, and there's been a lot of work done, and it was decided that CBUAs, contiguous built-up urban areas, captured the boundaries of a town better than LSOAs, particularly in Wales, where there's lots of rural areas and the LSOAs are very big. And by using LSOAs for even medium-sized places in the rural Wales, you'll capture a large hinterland, which wouldn't really represent the place itself. So there's been a lot of work by the ONS into contiguous built-up areas. I'm modelling raster maps to try and capture the edges of the built-up area. So that's why we use them as a concept of place, as opposed to the statistical census units. Obviously, they do map into it, and we did use LSOAs to map into the CBUAs. But in terms of defining base, it was we sort of worked with the Welsh Government on this, and we came to the agreement that CBUAs were better, particularly in rural areas, at capturing the sort of boundary of a particular place. They're not so good in urban areas. So the whole of Cardiff is one CBOA. And there is a debate whether or not we should drill down a bit more into the neighbourhoods in Cardiff and Swansea and Newport. But this is really looking at places which haven't been really represented before. So there's lots of data on Cardiff and Newport and Swansea. So we're less interested in those really. It was really the sort of mid-sized towns, which tends to be missing from a lot of policy stuff. So that's the emphasis on it. So that's what we use CBOAs for.
Were there any particularly surprising relationships that emerged? Was it a surprise that the places in the valleys have this different nature?
I don't think it was a surprise that they had a different nature, because a lot of there's been quite a lot of research in Wales. I'm sure Scott and Gary can tell you far better than I can about why the Welsh valleys are just generally different places, different in character, different in demographic characteristics compared to other places in Wales. So I don't think it was a surprise that they were different, because the towns were developed, I suppose, for a specific purpose in coal mining communities, industrial areas. So I don't think it was a surprise, but I don't know if Scott's got any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, we're really just at the start of this sort of drilling down into the data. So hopefully there will be some nice surprises coming through. There is also some interesting things going on in East Wales, which we didn't have time to cover today. But again, the similar deprived areas, and so you have some spatial clustering up there. One thing we haven't done yet is to look at cross-border flows between England and Wales. And during the pandemic, that became very important because it was illegal to cross the border in a lot of cases. So going forward for the website, sort of phase 3 of it is actually involving local authorities on the English border and collaborating with them to produce those sort of flows and an equivalent sort of cross-border dashboard. So we're really at the start of it. We spent a lot of time putting the dashboards together and not much time actually analysing the data that went into the dashboards, which is what we're doing now. So hopefully a lot more surprising things will come up, and hopefully there'll be some nice, interesting spatial variation across Wales. It won't just all be the same.